Today, I want to discuss some of the inherent possibilities that exist within the act of protest. I will be exploring the idea of protest as a structured process, an action which informs more pervasive acts of resistance, those which we commonly refer to as movements. I will build the argument that protest operates as a critical spatial practice. I've developed this timeline as a document, a platform which can be used to evidence the act of protest as a practice. Time runs from left to right. It is expanded and compressed at moments of interest in the development of protest within the UK. There are three main constructs: events, power, and representation. Events are at the top because these overarching events, such as wars and significant economic crashes, have a material effect on the country's citizens. The power nexus changes over time, from local tribal leaders to the establishment of monarchies and the idea of legislative power being embodied in a single individual. Over time, these powers are separated into institutions such as a legislative body, the development of a parliamentary system, and the influences of a free press and constructs such as a law enforcement body. The acts of disenfranchised citizen representation are contingent on all of these structures, so lies at the bottom of this map. However, these acts of dissent become manifest in opposition to decisions made by those above. The creation of the timeline allows me to see when spatial tactics such as marches, strikes, and occupations start to be utilized in the struggle for recognition and representation. This allows me to assess not only the development of a practice, but how the actions within inform the constructs above. In the UK, by the 1970s, the act of protest had started to operate as advocate to different social political agendas, which became manifest in space. So we can see a clear link between the ideologies within the Earth First movement, Stop the City demonstrations, Reclaim the Streets, the Carnival Against Capitalism, Climate Camp, and Occupy LSX, or London Stock Exchange, and the time period on which this presentation will focus. By restructuring the way that we look at events in history through the nexus of protest, political constructs, economic principles, spatial tactics, and societal norms can all be seen through this filter. I want to start with Henri Lefebvre and the idea that space doesn't just exist, but is constructed through a variety of different actions, practices, and tensions. It's important to realize that Lefebvre wants us to associate the social production of space on at least an equal platform to that of the material production of space. If we realize these possibilities, we can see the potential for spatial control to be a transformative act for citizens, as we have access to the means of social production. Today, I will focus on the protest activity bubble between 2010 and 2012, where people from a wide variety of backgrounds participated in a number of different protest activities. This was in no small part catalyzed by the global economic crash of 2007-8, the European sovereignty debt crisis which followed in 2010, and the austerity measures employed by governments such as quantitative easing, reductions in public spending, and an absence of legislation to punish those responsible for the crash, or the implementation of legislation to adequately prevent these actions from occurring. The protests were in essence a response to these developing events over which citizens did not have any control. The student tuition-free protests arose around objection to a parliamentary vote aimed to raise tuition fees from a maximum of £3,000 a year to £9,000 a year. The Occupy movement achieved many things, but at the forefront was a questioning of the culture and practices within powerful institutions, a focus on the unsustainability of the current system, which facilitates unregulated markets and their short-term speculation, as well as the inequalities that are created within societies globally. The August riots was a visceral reaction to those who felt, or indeed are and were disenfranchised, and their propensity or willingness to break the status quo in an attempt to express their discontent. The off-duty police officers' march was in line with many other actions of a disempowered national workforce, which is particularly poignant in a workforce who cannot unionize. What these acts of dissent do is allow us to develop an understanding of the problem. Each popular protest allows us to frame the issue. As such, these protests engage with issues in a way which clearly makes them a series of critical spatial practices. Protests are critical, in line with the writings of Peter Marcuse, particularly in 2009, when speaking about the way in which the theory of the right to the city can become embedded within practice. Here we are looking at protests which are a spatial phenomenon, those which operate within public spaces, as Henri Lefebvre describes them, the space of social practice. And of course, within that definition, practice is an act which is repeated and improved upon over time, in much the same way that de Certeau speaks about the practice of walking, as it allows us to start a conversation about the importance of repetition. As such, the act of protest develops as a series of repeated practices which have both a traditional and political requirement, both historically and within contemporary urban societies. Protest is both a spatial tradition, using occupations, marches, and riots to access physically accessible spaces, whilst also being a political requirement, allowing its participants to pursue a cause, aim, or ambition. This has tangible connections to Chantal Mouffe's theory on antagonism, as well as the right to the city as conceived by Lefebvre and revisited decades later by David Harvey. Where the theoretical position of practice and politics come together relate to the concept of commoning and the public role that private spaces play within the urban environment. The student tuition fee protests are initially legitimized as a traditional practice, with the first event attracting 50,000 attendees, even by conservative estimates, receiving broad approval from many sectors of society. However, in the month between their first march and the tuition fee vote itself, there were an additional 3 marches. Each march is increasingly divisive as the participants engage in a number of new spatial practices, pursuing unsanctioned routes, playing games of cat and mouse to access restricted areas, as well as increased rate of destruction to property. In addition to developments on the ground, they also employed the use of Suki, an online tool developed to work on top of Google Maps. It was used to inform participants on the ground of the location of different spatial tactics being used by law enforcement officials in real time. Occupy develops tactics which come out of a clear lineage of spatial practices developed in opposition to neoliberal ideals. However, they take a broad approach, utilizing a number of different strategies to negotiate their presence on the site. They treat the private space as if it has an embedded public role and capacity. There are many activities, but setting up an open kitchen and free university are of particular note, alongside the General Assembly. In these ways and others, the protest is traditional as it utilizes the idea of spatial occupation and is political in the agenda which it is pursuing. The August riots operate across an important temporal and historic landscape. The 4 days of rioting occur because a young black man dies at the hands of the police in Tottenham, in an area where the relationship between the police and the black community has been problematic for decades. For this reason, on hearing of his death, the family of the deceased, Mark Duggan, planned a peaceful march from Broadwater Farm, a place synonymous with the race riots of the 80s and 90s, to the police station closest to where Mark Duggan was killed. The march happened because there were suspicions from the family and the local community about the truth around the events preceding Mark's death. From this point on, divergent versions of the narrative emerge. However, it is clear that the main concern from those who had gathered was twofold: that the family did not get to speak to a senior officer, and that not enough information was received from the police in general. Over time, more people gathered outside the police station. The family went home and the station closed its doors. During the following period of time, as night fell, there was an altercation between a young woman and a police officer, which immediately flared into violence, which spread rapidly. As tragic and as avoidable as these events are, they are not as rare or as unforeseeable as this one example might suggest, especially if seen in comparison to others. In fact, a prescient example are the riots that took place in France in 2005, which had a similar catalyst. In this case, there were two young black boys who, after hiding from the pursuit of police officers, hid within an electrical substation where they were accidentally electrocuted to death. In the following peaceful march organized to question the treatment of Zayed Benar and Bouana Traoré by police officers, the route of the participants was blocked by police officers. In the ensuing altercation, France erupted in 14 days of rioting. What these and other race riots have in common are their trigger points. Significantly, the guilt or innocence of the victim at the center of the action becomes an irrelevant footnote. The focus point is the habitual demonization and marginalization that a minority within a society experiences. There are a series of events which bring together latent feelings of discontent and disenfranchisement into one highly charged moment. Here, it is not the action, but more the social, economic, political, and spatial cause which go under-examined when we consider these protests. As a complete antithesis, we will look at the Off-Duty Police Officers March. Since 1918-1919, police officers have not been able to unionize. This means that if they want to withdraw their labour, they have to do so as citizens, unlike other members of the public sector workforce, so they cannot go on strike. The participants chose to march through a number of significant locations. However, since 2005, to protest in proximity to spaces of power, specifically in the vicinity of Parliament Square, an application is required. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the off-duty police officers were granted permission to protest. So these participants engaged with the traditional practice of marching, even if they were unable to do so at the same time as their public sector counterparts, which led to an idiosyncratic use of space, such as protesters and police officers applauding one another, and the rarely seen sight of immediate departure from the site of a march at the prearranged time. The political antagonism that we so often see during protests in the UK was absent, as the relative anonymity that most expect whilst protesting is not achievable for such a clearly defined body, which under ordinary conditions has such power in society, which is missing at this point of examination. There are, of course, significant differences between participant, method, and outcome. However, what they all have in common is that they use acts of spatial dissent in an attempt to have their concerns considered on a platform that is recognized by representatives and powerful institutions. Move speaks of an antagonistic space. My argument is that spaces of protest should be included in this definition. These spaces are part of the same struggle as public space defines the urban environment and creates potential platforms where this desire can be pursued. So I'm going to use one of these protests as an example of the potential that the practice of protest contains, by theorizing outside of the consideration of whether a protest was successful in its political ambitions. I'm concerned with how it performs as a critical spatial practice while it is in existence. The example of Occupy LSX is interesting because it showcases the spatial adaptation of the protesters. The publicised target for Occupy was the London Stock Exchange due to their common practices which were cited as instrumental in the recent global economic crash. The London Stock Exchange is located in Paternoster Square. Historically a public space, Paternoster Square is now under the ownership of a single private body. So when protesters attempted to set up a camp within Paternoster Square, they were simply kettled out of that space. However, the act of kettling doesn't just keep people out of a space, it also aims to contain them within others. In this case, the zone indicated between Paternoster Square and St Paul's Cathedral. Kettling in and of itself is a problematic act, as it detains people indiscriminately for an unknown period of time who haven't committed a crime access to basic amenities such as sanitation. However, whilst being detained, the protesters pitched their tents where they were. This was mainly on land owned by the City of London, who were quick to pursue eviction. However, a number of the tents were located on land owned by the Church of England, who were not as quick to publicly demonise and support the eviction of peaceful protesters. This gave the protesters leverage. As a result, the relationship between the camp and church was in some ways rhizomatic, as the camp relies on negotiation with the church for their survival, and the church on the camp to be able to portray itself in a positive political and moral light in relation to the concerns of the camp, which were simultaneously held by many in society. The relationship was of course more complex. There were times when the church attempted to evict the camp, specifically on grounds of health and safety. However, the reflexivity of the camp and their practices meant that they were able to adapt to many of these plans to form arguments which would become the basis for eviction. This bought them time, and within 9 months the camp established a series of practices which can and should be considered as a rich source of ideas for how publicly accessible spaces can be utilised regardless of their political ambitions. In essence, they experimented with the validity of small-scale, accessible institutions within the public realm. Having put to one side the political ambitions of protesters for a moment, I will end by a very brief analysis of them. One of the main differences between popular protests and movements is their ability to operate at a number of different scales. We will always require the political space as catalyst, but when looking at the effectiveness of the M15 movement, the Indignados, which became Podemos in Spain, and Syriza, which started as a coalition of the radical left in Greece, much of it can be put down to their ability to operate at a number of different scales simultaneously. Similarly, their willingness and ability to detach themselves from the limitations of the inherent dominant political parties is something that separates them from the Momentum organisation in the UK. Again, if we return to a variation of the graphic which appeared earlier on, for the act of protest to be nexus and to engage with political, economic, spatial and societal constructs, we must also see the act of protest as a direct engagement with the right to the city. It is both exploratory, performative, and a tool by which to access the mechanism by which its participants can change society.